Why is Shedeur Sanders suddenly being labeled as a quarterback who can't read defenses right when his career is taking off? Anonymous sources, locker room whispers, and a cryptic message from Deion Sanders just turned this into something much bigger and far more suspicious. It started with a claim that didn't just raise eyebrows, it immediately divided the entire conversation around Shedeur Sanders. Out of nowhere, respected voices in the media began suggesting that he struggles with one of the most critical skills a quarterback can have, reading defenses. And just like that, a narrative was born. But here, the problem, this wasn't some minor critique about mechanics or decision-making. This was the kind of label that can completely reshape how a young quarterback is viewed across the league. Because when you tell people a QB can't read defenses, you're not just questioning his current performance, you're questioning his entire football IQ. You're planting doubt about whether he belongs at the next level at all. And that's exactly why this situation escalated so quickly. The name at the center of it, Jason Lloyd. During a recent discussion, he doubled down on claims that he had inside information, details coming from sources close to the situation. According to him, this wasn't speculation. This was something he believed to be real, but that's where things started to get complicated. Because almost immediately, people began pushing back, not casually but aggressively. Film analysts, former players, and quarterback specialists started breaking down actual game tape, pointing to moments where Shedeur clearly demonstrated the exact skills he was being accused of lacking. Adjustments at the line, recognizing defensive schemes, making smart reads under pressure. The evidence was there and it didn't match the narrative. So now the question wasn't just is this true, it became why is this being said at all? And maybe the most confusing part of all, this criticism didn't exist before. Not in his earlier seasons, not during his rise, not even when the spotlight was already on him. So why now? Why at this specific moment are these concerns suddenly being amplified? That timing didn't sit right with a lot of people. Because in the NFL, timing is never random. Narratives don't just appear out of thin air, especially ones this damaging. And when a story like this starts gaining traction without clear, verifiable proof, it forces everyone to start looking deeper. Because at that point, it's no longer just about performance on the field. It becomes about who's talking, who's listening, and who might be shaping the story behind the scenes. The moment Jason Lloyd leaned on anonymous sources, the entire conversation shifted, and not in a good way. Because in today's NFL media landscape, saying "I've got sources" isn't enough anymore. Fans want proof, names, something they can actually verify, and instead what they got only raised more questions. During the discussion, Lloyd insisted that the information was real. He even claimed he had text messages to back it up. But when the pressure started building, when he was directly asked to clarify, to explain, to provide anything concrete, the answers became noticeably vague. At one point, the conversation turned tense. Co-hosts pushed him, asked simple yes or no questions, and somehow those questions never got clear answers. Then came the moment that really caught people off guard. Instead of doubling down with clarity, Lloyd hesitated, deflected, even joked about invoking the Fifth Amendment. Now, whether that was said seriously or not didn't even matter at that point because the damage was already done. To many watching, it didn't come across as confidence. It felt like avoidance. And that's when the credibility of the entire narrative started to crack. Because here's the reality, if the claims about Shedeur Sanders were as serious as they sounded, then why hide the source? Why keep everything in the shadows while making such a bold public statement? That contradiction is what fueled the backlash. At the same time, there was a clear contrast forming. On one side, you had unnamed insiders making claims with no visible evidence. On the other, you had film analysts, former quarterbacks, and coaches publicly breaking down plays, showing actual footage, actual reads, actual decisions being made in real time. One side was asking people to trust them. The other was showing them exactly what they meant. And fans noticed that difference immediately. Some started questioning whether this was really about football at all. Others wondered if something deeper was going on behind the scenes. And while nothing was confirmed, the lack of transparency opened the door for speculation to grow fast. Because in situations like this, silence and vagueness don't calm things down, they do the opposite. They make people dig. They make people question everything. And more importantly, they make people start looking beyond the media and straight toward the locker room. As the media narrative kept building, the focus quietly started to shift away from just reporters and toward something much more uncomfortable, the locker room itself. Because once fans stopped fully trusting the outside claims, the next question became unavoidable: if this is coming from somewhere, where is it actually coming from? That's when whispers began to surface around Joel Bitonio. Now, to be clear, nothing has been officially confirmed. No direct statements, no verified reports, but some fans believe that certain veterans inside the organization may not be fully aligned with the attention and expectations surrounding Shedeur Sanders. And in the NFL, that kind of tension isn't new. When a young quarterback comes in with hype, confidence, and a strong identity, especially one connected to a figure like Deion Sanders, it can naturally disrupt the existing hierarchy. Veterans who have been in the system for years sometimes see things differently, not always out of jealousy, but out of pride, experience, and a belief in how things should be done. That's where things can quietly get complicated. Because leadership in an NFL locker room isn't just about talent, it's about respect. It's about who sets the tone, who speaks up, and who everyone listens to when things go wrong. And when a rookie or a young player stepping into a major role starts commanding attention early, it can create an unspoken divide. Some reports suggest there may be a difference in mindset between the old guard and the new direction the team is trying to move toward. Again, nothing confirmed, but enough chatter to get people paying attention. Enough to make fans wonder if these media narratives are really independent or if they're being influenced by voices behind the scenes. Because here's the bigger question: if everything in the locker room is solid, unified, and supportive, then why do these kinds of stories keep surfacing? Is it coincidence? Or is there a disconnect that hasn't been addressed publicly? That uncertainty is what keeps this story alive. Not facts, not proof, but the possibility that something isn't fully aligned beneath the surface. And in a league where chemistry can define an entire season, even small fractures can turn into major problems fast. But just when the speculation reached its peak, someone who knows the situation better than anyone else decided to respond. And he didn't do it directly. He did it in a way that made everyone read between the lines. Just when the noise around Shedeur Sanders reached a point where it felt impossible to ignore, Deion Sanders finally responded, but not in the way most people expected. There was no press conference, no direct callouts, no emotional outburst. Instead, what he did was far more subtle and arguably far more powerful. He went to social media, and within minutes, everything shifted. Coach Prime posted a message that on the surface didn't mention Shedeur, the media, or any specific individual. But the timing made it impossible to ignore. He wrote about lies, how they don't care who tells them, how they have no conscience, no emotion, but they do need attention. And most importantly, they need someone to carry them forward. That line alone was enough to send fans into a frenzy. Because it didn't take much to connect the dots. Some people saw it as a direct response to the ongoing claims being made by Jason Lloyd. Others believed it was aimed more broadly at the entire narrative that had suddenly formed around Shedeur. But what made it so effective was that it left just enough room for interpretation. It didn't accuse, it didn't confirm, it simply pointed. And sometimes that's more impactful than saying everything outright. But Coach Prime didn't stop there. Shortly after, he shared another message, this time about discipline, about learning to say no, and about avoiding situations that don't align with where you're trying to go in life. Again, no direct names, no explicit context, but paired with everything happening at that moment, it felt intentional. It felt like a message. And that's what made people start looking at this differently. Because this wasn't just a coach reacting to criticism anymore. This was a father, a Hall of Fame player, someone who has been around the game long enough to understand how narratives are built and how quickly they can spiral. And instead of feeding into the chaos, he chose control, precision, timing. That choice spoke volumes. Some fans interpreted it as confidence, like he knew the truth would eventually speak for itself. Others saw it as frustration, just expressed in a more calculated way. But either way, it made one thing clear: he was aware of everything being said. And he wasn't ignoring it. He was addressing it, just not in the way people were used to. Because in today's media environment, where everyone is quick to react, quick to argue, quick to escalate, silence or even controlled messaging can stand out more than noise. It forces people to slow down, to think, to read between the lines. And that's exactly what happened here. Fans, analysts, and even critics started revisiting the situation, not just focusing on the claims, but on the intent behind them, on the timing, on the consistency, on what was being said publicly versus what was actually being shown on the field. Because when someone like Deion Sanders chooses his words carefully, especially in a moment like this, it's rarely sluchaeakratkoina. And whether you agree with him or not, that response didn't just add to the conversation. It quietly changed it. At a certain point, this story stopped being just about football and started becoming something much more personal. Because behind all the headlines, debates, and speculation, there's a reality that often gets overlooked. Deion Sanders isn't just a coach analyzing talent or a Hall of Fame figure commenting from a distance. This is his son. This is Shedeur Sanders, a player he's coached, developed, and believed in long before any spotlight ever hit. And that changes everything. Because when criticism starts flying at this level, it doesn't just stay on the field. It follows you everywhere. It becomes headlines, conversations, and constant noise that never really turns off. Now imagine being in Deion's position, knowing exactly what your son is capable of, having watched every rep, every read, every moment of growth, and then hearing people publicly question his ability in one of the most fundamental areas of the game. Not effort, not consistency, but intelligence. That's not a small critique. That's a direct hit on how a quarterback is evaluated at the highest level. And what makes it even more frustrating for many is the timing. This isn't something that followed Shedeur throughout his early development. It wasn't a widely discussed weakness during his rise. In fact, for years, his understanding of the game was often praised. His composure, his decision-making, his control at the line of scrimmage. So when that suddenly gets flipped into a negative narrative, it doesn't just feel like criticism, it feels like a shift. A sudden one. From a father's perspective, that kind of shift is hard to ignore. Because Deion Sanders isn't just emotionally invested, he's uniquely qualified to evaluate what's being said. This is someone who has played at the highest level, studied the game from every angle, and spent years directly coaching his son. He's not guessing. He's not relying on second-hand information. He knows what Shedeur sees on the field because he helped teach him how to see it. So when that understanding is questioned publicly, it creates a different kind of tension. Not loud, not explosive, but controlled, focused, and very intentional. And that's exactly what we've seen. Instead of reacting emotionally or turning this into a public back and forth, Deion has stayed measured, calculated, almost surgical in how he addresses the situation. And in a way, that restraint says more than any direct response ever could, because it suggests confidence, not just in his son's ability, but in the idea that the truth doesn't need to be forced. It will show itself. At the same time, there's a deeper layer here that fans are starting to connect with. This isn't just about defending a player, it's about protecting a legacy. About making sure that years of work, discipline, and development aren't suddenly overshadowed by narratives that may not fully reflect reality. And for viewers watching all of this unfold, it hits differently. Because even if you take football out of the equation, the situation becomes relatable. Anyone who's ever seen someone close to them be misunderstood, misrepresented, or unfairly criticized can recognize what's happening here. That instinct to step in, to respond, to correct the narrative, it's natural. But choosing not to react impulsively, that's something else entirely. And that's what makes this moment stand out. Because while the media conversation continues to move and opinions keep shifting, one thing remains steady: Deion Sanders knows exactly who his son is as a player, and more importantly, as a person. Which raises a question that's getting harder to ignore. If the people closest to the situation are this confident, then why is the narrative outside telling a completely different story? When the conversation finally shifted away from opinions and back to actual football, something interesting happened. The narrative around Shedeur Sanders started to fall apart. Because once you go to the film, there's no hiding, no anonymous sources, no vague claims, just raw, undeniable evidence of what a player is actually doing on the field. And that's exactly where a lot of analysts decided to look. Former quarterbacks, film breakdown creators, and respected voices began dissecting Shedeur's game snap by snap. Not emotionally, not politically, just technically. What they found didn't match the criticism at all. In fact, it told a completely different story. Take pre-snap adjustments, for example, one of the clearest indicators of whether a quarterback can read defenses. Time and time again, Shedeur is seen at the line, scanning formations, recognizing pressure looks, and making audibles before the ball is even snapped. That's not guesswork. That's preparation meeting awareness in real time. Then there's post-snap processing, the part you can't fake. Once the defense shifts, once the disguise reveals itself, a quarterback has seconds, sometimes less, to make the right decision. And in multiple game situations, Shedeur shows exactly that ability. He moves through progressions, keeps his eyes downfield, and adjusts based on what the defense is giving him. That's not someone who's lost out there. That's someone in control. Even analysts like Chase Daniel, who has built a reputation around detailed quarterback breakdowns, have highlighted these exact traits. The way Shedeur handles pressure, the way he reads leverage, the way he understands timing within a play. These aren't surface-level observations, they're technical evaluations coming from people who have actually played the position. And that's where the disconnect becomes impossible to ignore. Because on one side, you have detailed film study showing a quarterback making smart, calculated decisions. On the other, you have a narrative suggesting he lacks one of the most fundamental skills required to play the position. Those two things can't both be true at the same time. So now the question shifts again. Is the film being overlooked? Or is it being ignored? Because in today's game, film doesn't just stay in meeting rooms anymore. It's public. It's accessible. Anyone with enough interest can watch the same clips, break down the same plays, and come to their own conclusions. And more often than not, fans who actually take the time to look are seeing something very different from what's being reported. They're seeing a quarterback who understands defensive structure. A quarterback who doesn't panic under pressure. A quarterback who's still developing, but clearly not lacking awareness. And that nuance matters. Because no young quarterback is perfect. There are always areas to improve: decision speed, anticipation, consistency. That's part of growth. But there's a difference between identifying weaknesses and completely misrepresenting a player's skill set, and that's where many believe the line may have been crossed. Still, it's important to stay grounded. Not every critique is an attack, not every report is false. The NFL is built on evaluation, and scrutiny comes with the position. But when the loudest claims don't align with what's visible on the field, it naturally raises doubt. It forces people to look closer, to question louder, and to separate what's being said from what's actually happening. Because at the end of the day, narratives can be shaped, opinions can be influenced, but film doesn't lie. And in this case, it might be telling a story that a lot of people weren't expecting. As this situation continues to unfold, it's becoming harder to ignore that this might be about more than just one player or one report. Because when you step back and look at the bigger picture, the pattern starts to feel familiar. Situations like this don't just happen randomly in the NFL. Timing, narratives, and perception, they all play a role, especially when a player like Shedeur Sanders is involved. Think about where he is in his career right now. This is a critical window. Every throw, every decision, every headline matters more than ever. It's the stage where opinions start to solidify, where teams, analysts, and fans begin forming long-term beliefs about what a player is and what they're not. And in moments like this, narratives can carry just as much weight as performance. Because once a label is attached, it's hard to shake. And that's what makes the timing of this situation so interesting. The criticism didn't gradually build over time. It didn't come after a long stretch of visible struggles. Instead, it appeared quickly, almost all at once, and immediately hit one of the most important aspects of quarterback evaluation. That alone is enough to raise questions, not necessarily about intent, but about influence. Because in the NFL, narratives don't just shape conversations, they can shape opportunities. Some fans believe that when certain storylines gain traction at the right or wrong moment, they can impact how players are viewed behind closed doors, how coaches talk about them, how front offices evaluate them, even how teammates respond to them. Again, none of this is confirmed, but the perception itself is powerful. And perception spreads fast. Especially in today's media environment where a single claim can turn into a trending topic within hours. One comment leads to another. One report gets echoed, repeated, and amplified. Before long, what started as a question begins to feel like a conclusion, even if the original foundation was never fully solid. That's how narratives take hold. And once they do, they can be incredibly difficult to reverse. Now add in the complexity of a franchise like the Cleveland Browns, a team that has dealt with instability, pressure, and constant scrutiny for years. Every move is analyzed, every decision is debated. And when a young quarterback enters that environment with expectations already attached, the spotlight only gets brighter. In situations like that, internal and external pressures can start to overlap. Media discussions influence fan reactions. Fan reactions influence the atmosphere, and that atmosphere can sometimes feed back into the organization itself. It's not always direct and it's not always intentional, but it's real. That's why some observers are starting to look at this situation differently. Not just as a disagreement over a player's ability, but as an example of how quickly narratives can form, evolve, and potentially impact a career. Because whether it's fair or not, once a storyline starts gaining traction, it becomes part of the conversation moving forward. And for a quarterback, that matters more than almost any other position. Because quarterbacks aren't just evaluated on stats. They're judged on leadership, composure, intelligence, qualities that are often subjective, often debated, and sometimes influenced by perception as much as performance. So when a narrative questions something like defensive awareness, it doesn't just stay in the film room. It follows the player into every discussion, every broadcast, every analysis moving forward. That's the real weight of what's happening here. And it's why the reaction has been so strong. Because to many watching this unfold, it doesn't just feel like normal criticism. It feels like a moment that could define how Shedeur Sanders is viewed moving forward, fairly or not. But even with all of that, there's still one thing that hasn't changed. The games will be played. The film will keep building. And eventually, the narrative will have to meet reality. Because in the NFL, perception can shape the moment. But performance decides what lasts. When you step back and look at everything that's unfolded, it becomes clear that this situation was never just about one comment, one report, or one disagreement. It's a collision of narratives, perception, timing, and pressure, all centered around Shedeur Sanders at one of the most important stages of his career. On one side, you have media claims driven by unnamed sources, raising serious questions about his ability to read defenses. On the other, you have visible film, analyst breakdowns, and real game situations that seem to suggest something very different. That contrast alone is enough to create confusion, but also enough to force people to choose what they believe. Because this isn't just about who's right or wrong. It's about which version of the story gains traction. And that's where things get complicated. In today's NFL landscape, narratives move fast. A single statement can turn into a widespread belief almost overnight, and once that belief settles in, it doesn't just disappear, it sticks. It follows players into every game, every broadcast, every conversation. Fair or not, it becomes part of how they're evaluated moving forward. That's the position Shedeur now finds himself in. Not just proving himself on the field, but also pushing against a narrative that questions one of the most critical aspects of his game. And the challenge with that is simple. Even if you perform well, some people will still look for confirmation of what they already believe. That's how powerful perception can be. At the same time, it's important to stay grounded. Not every report is an attack, not every criticism is baseless. The NFL is built on evaluation, and quarterbacks, especially young ones, are always under the microscope. Growth, mistakes, adjustments, that's all part of the process. But what makes this situation different is how quickly the narrative escalated and how strongly it contrasts with what many are seeing on the field. And that's why this story continues to hold attention. Because it leaves one question sitting right in the middle of everything. Is Shedeur Sanders being judged purely on performance, or is he being shaped by perception? That question doesn't have a simple answer. But it does have consequences. Because in a league where reputation can influence opportunity, where confidence can shape development, and where public opinion can quietly impact internal decisions, these moments matter more than they seem on the surface. They can define how a player is talked about, how they're trusted, how they're given chances, and sometimes how long they last. But here's the part that makes the NFL different from everything else. Eventually, the conversation runs out of speculation. Eventually, the noise fades. And what's left is the one thing no one can control: performance. The film keeps rolling, the games keep coming, and over time, every narrative is forced to confront reality, not opinions, not assumptions, just results. So while this situation may feel chaotic right now, it's also temporary. Because if Shedeur continues to show what many analysts already believe he can do, read defenses, control the game, and perform under pressure, then the narrative will have no choice but to adjust. And if it does, then that says even more about the system around him than it does about the player himself. Either way, the truth is coming. Not through reports, not through rumors, but through what happens when the ball is snapped. And when that moment comes, all the speculation, all the debate, all the noise will be tested against one thing only: reality. Because in the NFL, perception might shape the story at first, but performance decides how it ends.